Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. I'm joined today by Stephanie Draper, or Steph Draper, as you go. Steph is the chief executive of Bond, the UK NGO alliance and association, and she really spent the last 20 years working to accelerate a sustainable future, focusing on development. Previously, at the Forum for the Future, Steph focused on how to practically achieve that system change needed to deliver the SDGs. Now, as a chief change officer and a deputy CEO, she then shaped the sustainable nutrition goal. She went into the 1.5 degrees and sustainable value chains and livelihood labs, and trying to create new approaches to understanding impact. Steph, wonderful good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Chris.
You are a very impressive person, and I am going to very much enjoy feeding on some hard truth from you. Steph, can we dive right in?
Let's. That sounds great.
I'll tell you how I feel. The world is burning. The SDGs only about 8 years away, and they frankly seem further away than ever. Have we just failed, or are we about to?
That's a bleak perspective, but valid, I think, Chris. I think we are at risk of not getting close to the SDGs in terms of funding, in terms of sort of principles. But there are also lots of positive efforts moving in that direction. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a rocky road. It's going to be incredibly close. We do need to change the way that we do things and have more concerted focus on delivering on those SDGs in the next 9 years if we're going to make it.
So you sit at the center of a lot of conversations happening between development and aid organizations, mainly in the UK, but by nature also connected to Europe and the US and the world, in fact. You don't sound too positive, Steph. You said it's going to be a rocky road. What is it going to take us to get there?
Well, we're at a real sort of crossroads for international development right now. We have the external context. You've talked about climate change, increasing crisis, insufficient funding just for humanitarian response. And in the UK, we also have just had the aid cuts. And we are seeing wavering public support for aid and development too. There's lots of loyal supporters, but politically, it's somewhat challenged. So that is a difficult situation for aid agencies to be in, but it's also an opportunity for necessary change. So we've been talking about becoming more locally led for a long time. This is an opportunity to really start to make that happen in practice. We have opportunities to come together in more diverse coalitions with environmental NGOs, with trade unions, with even with business, to actually look at the wider systems that need to change, the economic system that needs to change if we're actually going to achieve deep, sustained change that gets us beyond the sustainable development goals into a just and sustainable future.
Okay, so that's good. That still sounds like a dire warning, but with some activism around. What does it take for an NGO, or any development and aid organization to get there? You've mentioned shifting the power. You mentioned localization. What else does the NGO of the next 8 years and then the future really need to get a grip on in order to have the impact we so desperately need?
So, I think there are a number of things. I think the first is really get a grip on the changing external context and how and understanding the future and tracking what's coming down the line, be that technology, be that different development actors, be that what non-state actors are doing in the countries that agencies are working in. The second is to get more local and to partner and to really sort of drive that locally led approach. We have seen that we work on the assumption that locally led development is more sustainable and going to be more effective for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third is looking at your own organizations and seeing what does a locally led model mean for you in terms of business model, in terms of funding, in terms of kind of different forms of enterprise and role and purpose in the world. And then the final thing is to mobilize, is to look and seek to influence international systems, national systems that shape the way that things like the Sustainable Development Goals play out.
Excellent. Okay, so three major actions that pretty much any international NGO can take here. I really like the summary of that. Thanks for that, Steph. Let's talk about that last point, funding. There's a huge funding gap, and it's really getting worse. You and I know that the UN predicts a 17% rise in emergency aid requirements, and that's going to impact more than 270 million people this year. And then there's climate change that already pushed another 100 million people into poverty, that the number of poor people has actually increased during the pandemic, and it's inducing famine in countries like Madagascar right now. So given that, and given that the UN also says, look, we need $40 billion a year just to cover the humanitarian requirements, which isn't a solution. It's just a plaster, right? It's just the assistance to life-saving assistance. And they only expect to get half of that from traditional donors. The funding gap is huge. How do you see that as overcomable, as solvable for an organization that is mandated to address that?
This is obviously a massive question. I think there are two things that might make a contribution. So the first is, can we look at getting to the root causes of problems? And so we look at things like peace building ahead of humanitarian aid. We look at kind of pre-fragility before fragile states become sort of conflict zones. And that is not just about funding. It's about diplomacy. It's about kind of engagement. It's about support. And it is about empowering local communities. So I think if we can be a little bit more focused on prevention rather than cure, that is going to be more cost effective. The second thing is that we are focused on ODA as the route to funding these crises.
ODA, we also need to be official development aid.
Official development aid. We also need to be looking at what are the other funding mechanisms. So this year we're going to see the results from the experiments in the humanitarian impact bond. Is that going to be a route to change? Are there other sort of financial instruments? We also see organizations in country looking at kind of local fundraising. So how can we actually shift and innovate across that funding landscape and use some of the changes in the financial, there's a whole world of fintech. What can that deliver for us in terms of impact investment and moving in that direction? I have kind of quite a lot of expertise in futures and looking forward.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in the financial solutions needed to solve our funding challenges, but I do think that there is innovation available to us that we need to be more actively using.
That's okay, Steph. I'm a chartered accountant, and you're allowed to talk about finance. That's all right. Let's talk about business. In my role at MZN, I am at a crossroad talking between donors, NGOs, and businesses a lot. And businesses are increasingly, and investors particularly, are increasingly interested in prevention, into making where there's raw materials, where their business takes place on either in the supply chain or in the value creation chain, making that more resilient to shocks, which is just good business interest, and also partnering with NGOs. So talk me through a little bit about your perspective, Steph, on your future role. What is the role of business? What is the role of investors? Should we just simply give money to the NGOs, work more with donors, simply bypass them, as is happening sometimes, as incapable talkers around moderators of problems? That is a quote from an investor, unfortunately. Outsiders looking on them might get the impression that they are just doing their own thing, the business and the investors. What is their role, and how can we bridge that?
Well, I think if we go back to first principles and think about what does sort of development need to look like. So if we're sort of advocating for locally led development, which is something that I think we at Bond think is really important, that is driven by initiatives owned and led by people in their own context. And within that community, there are local actors making decisions. There are local enterprises making decisions. There are, so business and enterprise and market-driven solutions are an important part of a sustainable economy. And that is going to be sort of critical at all levels. How then you sort of make sure that you are not, that large businesses not coming in and sort of taking over from those, is about how the economy is regulated by national governments, all of that. So I think if we were to start from, we want local communities to be able to make their own decisions, then you would be focusing on the role of local enterprise, but also how can then international businesses, through their sustainability practices, their commitment to the SDGs and wanting to make the world a better place, how can they support that practice rather than coming in and doing their own projects, which are short term and not necessarily going to be sustainable? So how can they sustain local markets? I think is a really important part of the role of business. In my previous job, I was working with a lot of progressive businesses and B Corps, which is a way of committing to having a social purpose alongside your financial one. And they were very sort of keen to be making strides and contributing to things like the Sustainable Development Goals. How much they were sensitive to that kind of local context and need to empower people on the ground to be able to make their own decisions was less clear.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, so is that your message for business leaders, hearing from a well-versed, well-situated development practitioner, to be more sensitive to the local circumstances and work with and possibly even through the NGOs? Should the NGOs be a gatekeeper here?
Well, there are lots of our members who have partnerships with businesses, and they see that is a very effective way of having a balance. I think, so yes, that's a sort of key part. I think also for business, there are some fundamental things like paying taxes and not getting involved in any sort of avoidance on that basis, so that you are contributing to the countries that you're operating in, so that they can actually have their own safety nets and their own support systems. Lots of those basic things are really critical too.
Good, excellent. I completely agree, of course. I would even go further than that is the bare minimum. Legal compliance is absolutely essential. I know I would refuse to work with anybody who doesn't, but as would you, I'm sure. But also actively protecting and furthering their wider stakeholders, not just their shareholders. And I think
Absolutely,
that is something we can both agree on. And in fact, most business leaders I speak to every day, they agree with that as well. Let's talk about Bond briefly before we conclude. Bond is an interesting, and personally, I'm very impressed by Bond, an interesting animal. What does the future for Bond look this year and in the next few years?
So we are going to be majoring in a few really significant areas. So Bond's strategy combines wanting to shape the political landscape so that it's positive for global equity and justice, wanting to help the sector to transform and respond to the challenges that we've been talking about. And also, we are a dynamic network that we want to enable organizations to learn from each other. So we have a major strand, which is around decolonizing and decentralizing development and helping the sector to be safe and resilient. And that this year is going to be really focused on, we've been doing a lot of work helping to catalyze real practical change when it comes to locally led development. And we are going to bring the progress and sort of the practical examples that we've been working with our members on into a symposium in the middle of the year, where we're going to look to make progress collectively. So that's a really significant thing for us this year. We think that we've all been talking about being locally led for a long time, and this is and we are now in a really good position to make progress on that. The second piece is around how do we influence in quite a turbulent political environment, and how do we look beyond the immediate to reshaping our agenda and our organizations and our sector more widely, so that we can respond and actually sort of deliver more sustainable solutions and our wider ambitions in the longer term. So we're running a program called the Future Dialogues, which is bringing together leading thinkers and the innovations that are happening in areas like finance, as we talked about, in economic models, in delivery of humanitarian and development work, and looking for what are the best ideas that are out there and how can we package them up into new models of how we might work in the future, and then use that in our influencing to shape what we're thinking about going forward. We're also going to be continuing to maintain pressure and focus on rights and international institutions. We're very concerned about closing down of people's capacity to influence, of what we call civic space, which is where civil society organizations have rights to protest and freedom of assembly and all those things. So that kind of attack on rights by authoritarian regimes, but some of our own governments too, is something that we will continue to work on. And then finally, how do we take really learn from each other and deepen our understanding? So lots of the thinking, and how do we bring thinking like yours, Chris, on sort of agile organizations to a wide range of our members and help them to learn from each other so that they are kind of dynamic, positive, anti-racist organizations in and of themselves, where people really feel joy when they go to work.
I can share that with you, and I share that conviction with you. That sounds really interesting, those plans for Bond this year and coming on. It's an essential organization. I'll recommend anybody checking all the resources and the articles on Bond's website and maybe participating in the futures conversation. It is genuinely more than just talking about it and preaching to the prayer. It seems very solution orientated. That's at least from my perspective.
That's certainly what we want to be. And yeah, making things happen, getting beyond the rhetoric into practice is really critical right now.
Indeed, indeed. I can share that those private sector investors and business leaders that I speak to on a regular basis every week, the change that I have noticed over the last year and a half or 2 years really is that this democratic, participative, rights-based space in which we've built our wealth. Let's not forget about that. Um, it may have been taken for granted, and lots of investors tell me now we may have failed to heed the lessons from the financial crisis 2008 2009. Now we really need to learn them, and if we as businesses and as investors do not protect, strengthen, and certainly do everything we can do to not harm those public goods, then we may deteriorate the basis on which our business is built. And that is no longer a nice theoretical concept. This is no longer even for the large investors. This is pretty much for all of them. They say, if I work in a local community, that community must be, I must do everything I can to keep them safe, protect their rights. That will ensure that I have stability and ensure that I've got better employees and better customers. So that conversation seems to be coming to a head. I really enjoy and think that the conversations you have within and in the network of Bond seem to head in the right direction. And I look forward to contributing to joining those two strands of debate together, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Global public goods is, and addressing things like climate change and the pandemic collectively is going to be, the challenge of our generation and the next.
Indeed. Personal question before we finish off. All this is incredibly serious and global and interacted, and one has to keep a balanced view and tolerate a lot of interesting voices, put it this way, whilst overcoming the pragmatic challenges of the day that everybody as a leader and you may face as a leader as well. Personally, Steph, how do you stay balanced? How do you ensure that you go to work every day better than yesterday?
Well, I do a lot of things. One of the things I do, which might amuse you, is every morning I play a minimum of 3 tracks and have a little dance before I start work. And it's really uplifting. I also meditate, which is a kind of more serious kind of grounding.
Yeah.
But I find that the dancing makes me feel joyful before I start my day, and puts things into perspective. You can't ever feel down if you're dancing.
Can you commit here on what will eventually be published, that one day you will post a video recording of you dancing in your bathroom in the morning? Can I get a commitment to that, please?
I don't know whether people will want to see me dancing in my dressing gown, but I'm sure there are videos of me dancing somewhere.
Okay, we're committing to finding them and linking them. No, jokes aside. Steph, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a far-ranging one. Thank you also for the good partnership that Amsterdam and Bond developed over the last 2 years. I really enjoy working with everybody in your team as well. And I'm very much hoping that we can have a cup of tea, coffee together in the very near future.
Yes, me too. It is a fantastic partnership and I love the work that you do and really enjoy the webinars that we put together. But a coffee would be fantastic in real life.